On a cold January night in 1993, the lights of a small chicken restaurant went dark. By morning, 7 people were dead, the killers had vanished, and a quiet suburb was thrust into a nightmare that would drag on for a decade. This is the story of the Brown's Chicken Massacre. It was a night like any other in Palatine, Illinois. The kind of cold January evening when the snow piled on street corners and the suburbs seemed quieter than usual. Families were home, tucked in from the winter chill, while the hum of fluorescent lights still glowed inside one small restaurant at the edge of a shopping plaza. Brown's Chicken. To most people, it was just another fast food joint. Fried chicken, fries, and coleslaw served beneath a bright yellow logo. But for 7 people working late that Friday night in 1993, it would become the last place they were ever seen alive. The Brown's Chicken Massacre. That's what the newspapers would call it. A name that would haunt Illinois, echo through courtroom walls, and scar an entire community for decades. But this story isn't just about the violence that unfolded in that building. It's about the lives stolen, the families left behind, the mistakes and triumphs of the police, and a manhunt that dragged on for nearly a decade before justice was finally brought to those responsible. To understand how a suburban chicken restaurant became the scene of the worst mass murder in Illinois history, we have to go back. Back before the crime, before the killers, before the horror. Because this tragedy wasn't just about a single night, it was about people. The victims, the families, and the choices, both small and devastatingly large, that set everything into motion. It begins with a company, Brown's Chicken. Founded in the 1940s by John and Belva Brown, the restaurant was built on the simple idea of serving fried chicken, the way families liked it, golden, crispy, and affordable. By the 1980s, it had become a familiar name in Chicagoland. Not flashy, but dependable. The kind of place you'd stop with your kids after a soccer game, or grab a quick dinner on the way home from work. But by the early 1990s, Brown's wasn't just a business. It was a lifeline for franchise owners like Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt. The Ellenfelts had poured everything into their restaurant. Years of savings, long days, 16-hour shifts. To them, the Palatine Brown's was more than a storefront. It was their future. Richard was meticulous, a man who thrived on keeping order in chaos. Lynn was warm, nurturing, the kind of boss who looked out for her young employees as if they were her own children. Together, they made the restaurant work. And then, on January 8, 1993, everything changed. That night, 7 people, Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt, Michael Castro, Guadalupe Maldonado, Marcus Nelson, Thomas Menace, and Rico Solis, clocked in for their shifts. It should have been just another Friday, busy with orders, full of noise from the fryers, plans for the weekend already on their minds. But as the clock neared closing time, 2 men entered. Jim Degorski and Juan Luna. Neither was there for food. They were there for something far darker. What happened next would leave 7 bodies in a freezer, a community in shock, and police scrambling for answers. And yet, despite the horror of that night, the killers would walk free for almost 10 years. This is the story of the Brown's Chicken Massacre. The lives it destroyed, the investigation that stretched on for nearly a decade, the trials that tested the system, and the families who never stopped seeking justice. It's a story of tragedy, but also of endurance, of mistakes, but also persistence. And it begins, like all tragedies do, with ordinary people whose lives were about to be shattered forever. That night in Palatine, most people driving past the strip mall at Northwest Highway and Smith Street saw nothing unusual. The glow of the Brown's Chicken sign cut through the dark, the same as it had for months since Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt had taken over the restaurant. Cars slowed at the intersection, headlights gliding across the snowy curb. But no one suspected that inside, the fate of 7 lives was already being sealed. To understand how tragedy arrived here, we have to first step into the lives of the people who kept that restaurant running. Richard and Lynn were not newcomers to hard work. They had lived through the grind of politics, community service, and years of balancing family with demanding careers. By the early 1990s, after layoffs and financial setbacks, they staked everything on the dream of running their own Brown's franchise. It was a gamble, a leap of faith backed by borrowed money and long hours. Richard had always been methodical. He liked systems, order, and efficiency. In the chaos of the kitchen, with fryers bubbling and teenagers scrambling to fill orders, he was in his element. Lynn brought something different. She had the warmth of a mentor, treating her young staff not just as employees, but as kids she wanted to see succeed. She remembered birthdays. She asked about school. She quietly helped when one of them struggled. Among those staff members was Michael Castro, just 16, a high school student, eager to earn extra cash and contribute to his family. His parents trusted the job. It was close by, in a safe suburb, nothing to fear. For Michael, the restaurant was supposed to be a stepping stone, not a final destination. There was Guadalupe Maldonado, a father who'd come to Illinois searching for steady work. He had a quiet determination, the kind carried by so many who came to this country with little but a willingness to work hard. His family depended on the paycheck, and Brown's was a place that gave him that stability. There was Marcus Nelson, only 31, and Thomas Menace, a teenager with a ready laugh. And there was Rico Solis, a man who never missed a chance to brighten the room with his energy. Each one of them walked into that building that Friday night thinking about ordinary things. Family dinners, weekend plans, the comfort of routine. None of them knew they would never leave. But even before the killers stepped inside, the forces that led to this night had been building for years. In another suburb, not far from Palatine, a young man named Jim Degorski was spiraling. To his peers, he was a troublemaker, moody, unpredictable, often cruel. Friends described him as someone who bragged about violence, who liked the feeling of control, and who often lashed out without warning. He carried himself with a cocky swagger, claiming he was destined for something big. His friend Juan was different on the surface, quieter, less volatile. But the two shared a connection built on recklessness and resentment. They were bonded by mischief, petty crimes, and the allure of doing something that would make them stand out. And in the days before January 8, 1993, they began talking about a plan. A plan to walk into a Brown's Chicken restaurant after closing, rob it, and leave no witnesses behind. It was, in their minds, a thrill, a chance to shock the world. The employees inside the Palatine Browns had no idea that their paths were about to collide with two men who cared nothing for their lives. The night wore on like any other Friday. Orders came in. Grease sizzled. The floor was mopped as closing time neared. Then, around 9 p.m., the front door opened. Two men walked in. They ordered food, sat down, and waited. On the surface, nothing unusual. But beneath it, a storm had arrived. In the hours that followed, the ordinary routine of a suburban chicken restaurant would transform into the scene of one of the deadliest crimes Illinois had ever seen. And when police finally entered that building the next morning, what they found inside would shock even seasoned investigators. By 9:30 that evening, the Brown's Chicken in Palatine was winding down. The dinner rush had passed, the fryers had quieted, and most customers had gone home to their warm suburban kitchens. Employees swept the tiled floors, refilled napkin dispensers, and stacked trays. The night felt ordinary, monotony wrapped in fluorescent light. Then came two men who looked, to anyone watching, like late-night customers. Jim Degorski and Juan stepped through the glass doors, ordered food, and sat in a red vinyl booth as if nothing were out of the ordinary. They chewed slowly, watching, waiting. What no one knew was that these two weren't there for chicken. They had come with a revolver, rope, and a plan. The minutes ticked by. Richard and Lynn, ever the responsible owners, stayed late to lock up and finish paperwork. Their young crew worked alongside them, wiping down counters and counting the cash register. It was a Friday night in suburbia, safe, predictable, forgettable. That illusion was about to shatter. At some point, Degorski and Luna rose from their booth. They approached the counter. In their eyes, the moment had come. What happened inside that restaurant in the following hour would never be fully known to anyone except the two men who carried it out. But what is certain is this. One by one, the employees and the Ellenfelts were corralled, threatened, and shot. The sound of gunfire that echoed in that building was muffled by the winter night. Outside, cars drove past, their drivers unaware. Snow-muffled sound. Glass doors reflected only darkness. No one noticed. When it was over, 7 people lay dead. Their lives extinguished in minutes by men who treated murder like sport. And then came the silence. The killers fled. The Browns sat still, its lights humming. In the parking lot, cars sat as if their owners had simply gone home. Inside, in the freezer, lay 7 victims of a massacre that would horrify Illinois and baffle investigators for years. Hours passed. Midnight. 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Families grew uneasy. Michael Castro's parents waited for their son to come home, staring at the clock, wondering why he was late. Calls went unanswered. The night stretched into early morning. Worry gave way to dread. By dawn, January 9, 1993, the phone at the Palatine Police Department rang. Concerned parents, anxious friends, co-workers, all reported the same thing. Something was wrong at Brown's Chicken. Officers were dispatched to the restaurant. From the outside, the building looked quiet, even peaceful. But as police peered through the windows, unease grew. Food trays still sat out. Chairs were scattered. But there was no movement. The doors were locked. Lights buzzed inside. Something was terribly wrong. When officers forced their way in, the scene that met them was every cop's nightmare. In the back of the restaurant, in the freezer, they found bodies. 7 of them, executed. Blood pooled on the floor, staining a place once meant for family dinners and neighborhood gatherings. The officers stood frozen, struggling to process what they were seeing. It was unlike anything they had encountered. A small-town police department suddenly staring at one of the deadliest crime scenes in state history. The news spread quickly. Reporters arrived. Yellow tape went up. And in the parking lot, families began to gather. Parents who had prayed their children were simply working late now collapsed in grief as the truth emerged. Michael Castro's father broke down, his cries captured on camera. Lynn and Richard's daughters, stunned, struggled to comprehend that both their parents were gone in one night. The Browns Chicken Massacre, as it would be called, had left not just 7 dead, but an entire community shattered. Palatine, a quiet suburb where crime was supposed to be distant, now became the center of national headlines. For residents, the safety of suburbia itself felt violated. If something this brutal could happen here, it could happen anywhere. And as investigators combed through the blood-stained restaurant for clues, one question echoed louder than all others. Who could do this? The Palatine Police Department was not built for this. In 1993, it was a suburban force accustomed to burglaries, domestic disputes, the occasional stolen car. Nothing in their training had prepared them for 7 murders in a fast food freezer. The crime scene was overwhelming. Officers carefully stepped around shell casings, bullet fragments, and overturned chairs. The smell of fried food still clung to the air, mingling grotesquely with the metallic tang of blood. In the back, the freezer door stood ajar. Inside, the 7 bodies lay stacked and crumpled. Some had been shot multiple times. None had been spared. Investigators quickly realized they weren't just dealing with a robbery gone wrong. Whoever had done this hadn't left witnesses by chance. They had executed them deliberately. That alone made this different. It spoke of cruelty, of calculation, of killers who wanted to erase everyone in that room. Word spread quickly through Palatine. Neighbors gathered near the shopping plaza, clutching cups of coffee in the freezing air, whispering to each other in disbelief. Reporters shoved microphones into the faces of grieving parents. TV cameras zoomed in on the yellow tape, the flashing lights, the distraught cries of families who had come searching for loved ones. For the Castro family, the news was unbearable. Michael, just 16, had gone to work like any other Friday night. His parents had expected him home hours earlier. Instead, they were told their son had been found dead in a freezer. His father's wails were caught on local news cameras, his grief broadcast across the city. The Ellenfeld daughters were thrust into a nightmare no child should endure. Both parents gone. One night of work at their restaurant had destroyed their family forever. Palatine, a town of only 50,000, was instantly transformed. Residents locked their doors. Parents kept their children closer. Strangers eyed each other with suspicion. The idea that this had happened in their community was impossible to digest. It wasn't Chicago with its reputation for crime. It wasn't some faraway city. It was here. Within hours, the FBI was called in. Illinois State Police arrived. Cook County investigators joined the effort. What began as a local tragedy ballooned into a massive, multi-jurisdictional case. The Brown's Chicken Massacre was no longer just a crime scene. It was a statewide emergency. Detectives searched for clues. Cash registers had been emptied, pointing toward robbery. Shell casings were bagged. Bullets were retrieved from walls. Blood samples were swabbed. Every surface was combed. But in those first days, the leads were thin. No fingerprints that could be tied to a suspect. No clear motive beyond money. It was the kind of case that demanded quick answers, but none came. The killers had vanished into the night, leaving behind 7 bodies and a silence that screamed louder than any confession. For the families, time slowed. Funerals followed in rapid succession, one after another. Caskets lowered into frozen ground. Communities gathered in pews, singing hymns through tears. The names, Richard, Lynn, Michael, Guadalupe, Marcus, Thomas, Rico, became etched into local memory. And yet, while the families grieved, investigators began to feel the weight of expectation. Reporters hounded them. Have you made any arrests? Do you have suspects? Politicians demanded progress. The public wanted answers. The police had little to give. The massacre had happened in minutes, but solving it would take years. That January weekend marked the start of a manhunt that would stretch nearly a decade. A manhunt that would test the patience of the victims' families, the persistence of police, and the resolve of prosecutors. But on that first night, in the hours after the discovery, all anyone knew was that Palatine had been changed forever. A quiet suburb had been violated. 7 innocent lives had been taken. And 2 killers were out there, free, blending back into the fabric of everyday life, as if nothing had happened. And so the question remained, heavy in the frozen air. Who killed the 7 at Brown's Chicken? In the hours after the discovery, the Palatine Police Department became the epicenter of grief and chaos. Parents filled the lobby, begging for answers. Reporters pressed in, their cameras flashing in the faces of detectives who hadn't slept. The phone lines lit up nonstop with tips, rumors, and frantic calls from residents wondering if the killers were still in their town. Chief Jerry Bratcher, a man who had led a quiet suburban force until this moment, stood before the cameras and told the public what they dreaded to hear. 7 people had been murdered inside Brown's Chicken. He promised every resource would be dedicated to finding those responsible. But even as he spoke, Bratcher knew the road ahead would be brutal. For the families, the world collapsed. Michael Castro's parents struggled to comprehend how their 16-year-old son, who had kissed them goodbye before heading to work, could be gone forever. The Ellenfelt daughters sat stunned, realizing both their parents had been murdered in the very place they had poured their life savings into. For the Maldonado family, grief was compounded by the harsh reality of losing a provider, a father, a man who had come to this country to build a better life. The funerals came quickly. In Palatine, Arlington Heights, and beyond, churches overflowed with mourners. Teachers wept over the loss of their students. Friends carried caskets while snow fell silently outside. Candles flickered in makeshift vigils. 7 lives, 7 stories, all cut short by a pair of men who had walked into a restaurant and decided no one inside would leave alive. Meanwhile, investigators faced a nightmare. The killers had left behind no clear trail. No security cameras. No eyewitnesses who survived. The only certainty was the brutality of the act. Detectives clung to fragments. Bullets, blood, fingerprints smudged beyond use. They knew the killers had eaten food in the restaurant before carrying out the murders, leaving half-eaten chicken behind. Samples were collected and preserved, though in 1993, DNA technology was still in its infancy. At the time, those scraps of evidence felt like little more than a long shot. As the days turned into weeks, the people of Palatine grew restless. Parents watched their children more closely. Restaurants that once bustled late into the night saw business drop sharply. No one wanted to linger in a fast food place after dark. The very idea of safety in suburbia had been shaken. The media, too, kept the pressure alive. Every anniversary of the crime brought fresh headlines. Still no arrests in Brown's Chicken Massacre. Talk radio buzzed with theories. Some speculated the crime had been mob-related. Others wondered if it was the work of a serial killer. For nearly everyone in the Chicago suburbs, the Brown's Chicken Massacre became a wound that never closed. Behind the scenes, detectives worked relentlessly, chasing every lead. They interviewed former employees, scoured criminal records, and looked into anyone with a grudge against the company. Names surfaced, suspects were questioned, and yet, time after time, the trail went cold. By the end of that first year, frustration set in. Families feared the case might never be solved. Critics accused the police of being unprepared. And though Chief Bratcher defended his department, even he knew the investigation was slipping into darkness. Still, one thing was certain. The killers had made mistakes. And though it would take nearly a decade, those mistakes would eventually come back to haunt them. But in January of 1993, as winter settled over Palatine, all anyone could feel was fear. Fear that two men capable of such slaughter were walking free. Fear that they might strike again. Fear that justice, for the 7 lost lives, might never come. And that was how installment 1 of the Brown's Chicken story closed. Not with resolution, but with an open wound. A crime scene sealed in yellow tape. Community grieving in silence. And a question that hung heavy in every home. Who could be so cold, so ruthless, so utterly without conscience? The answer, as the world would learn years later, was closer than anyone imagined. The morning after the Brown's Chicken Massacre, Palatine was no longer the quiet suburb it had been the day before. The restaurant parking lot was still cordoned off with yellow tape, but around it swirled a circus of cameras, reporters, and grieving families. To many residents, it felt like their town had been dropped onto the front page of every newspaper in America. The images from that morning are unforgettable. The Castros collapsing into each other as they learned Michael, just 16, would never come home. Friends of Guadalupe Maldonado clutching each other outside the scene, whispering prayers in Spanish. Neighbors who had once felt insulated from the dangers of the city, now shuddering at the thought that such savagery had unfolded a few blocks from their homes. For police, the pressure was immediate and suffocating. Chief Jerry Bratcher, who had never commanded a case of this magnitude, suddenly found his department thrust into the national spotlight. The FBI arrived, followed by Cook County investigators, forensic teams, and reporters from as far away as New York. Bratcher knew the first 48 hours were critical. If the killers weren't caught quickly, the trail could grow cold forever. Inside the Browns, crime scene technicians worked meticulously. Every object was photographed, bagged, cataloged. They found shell casings from a .38 revolver, blood stains on the tiled floors, and scattered paperwork. The most unusual discovery was in the kitchen garbage, a pile of half-eaten chicken. It didn't look like much, just discarded food. But careful detectives saved it, wrapping it, freezing it, preserving it as possible evidence. At the time, DNA science was barely emerging. In 1993, few could imagine that greasy chicken bones would one day help solve the crime. Outside the restaurant, investigators canvassed the area. They knocked on doors of nearby businesses. Had anyone seen something unusual late Friday night? Any strange cars in the parking lot? A few witnesses reported glimpses. A dark car, maybe 2 men loitering near closing time. But nothing solid. The first theory was obvious. Robbery. The cash registers had been emptied. But the brutality of the crime, 7 executed in cold blood, suggested something deeper. Why kill everyone, including teenagers, when simply stealing the money would have been enough? The sheer cruelty puzzled detectives. In the weeks that followed, leads poured in by the hundreds. Former employees of Brown's were questioned. Rumors flew that the massacre might have been tied to organized crime. Some pointed fingers at disgruntled workers, others at shadowy loan sharks. A few even suggested it was a random thrill killing. Detectives worked 18-hour days, chasing every tip. At one point, investigators thought they had a promising suspect, a man with a history of violence who had once worked at the restaurant. He was interrogated, surveilled, and even publicly named in whispers around Palatine. But nothing stuck. The evidence didn't align. He was eventually cleared, though not before his reputation was destroyed by suspicion. Meanwhile, the families of the victims endured a grief that seemed endless. Funerals blurred together. The Castro family buried Michael with the tender rituals of a life cut tragically short. The Ellenfelds daughters faced the unimaginable task of saying goodbye to both parents at once. The community turned out in droves. Funeral processions stretching for blocks, pews packed with mourners, candles flickering in vigil. Palatine itself seemed paralyzed. Restaurant sales plummeted across the suburbs. Parents were reluctant to let their children work late-night shifts at fast food joints. Brown's Chicken locations saw a drop in customers, their once friendly yellow signs now tainted with associations of violence. As weeks turned to months, frustration mounted. Reporters hounded police at press conferences, demanding to know if progress had been made. Each time, Bratcher and his detectives repeated the same lines. "We are following every lead. We will not rest until those responsible are brought to justice." But privately, morale sagged. The killers had vanished into the anonymity of suburban life, blending back into traffic, jobs, and friendships. No one suspected that the two responsible were young men already known in Palatine. Men who had bragged in whispers but whose boasts were dismissed as drunken bluster. And yet, somewhere in the evidence, buried in the piles of reports, the stacks of tips, and even the garbage saved from that restaurant, lay the key to solving the case. The problem was, in 1993, no one could see it yet. For the detectives on the case, every day brought new pressure. The phones at the Palatine station rang constantly. Some callers swore they knew who had done it. Others offered bizarre theories, pointing to shadowy strangers, rival chicken franchises, even satanic cults. The sheer volume of tips was overwhelming. Every scrap had to be checked, logged, and followed. Most went nowhere. The community's need for answers was insatiable. Local newspapers ran headlines that screamed of failure. Still no arrests in Brown's massacre. Talk radio hosts stoked the frustration, accusing the police of incompetence. Rumors spread like wildfire through Palatine. That the killers were known to police, that there had been a cover-up, that the FBI was holding back information. The strain on the Palatine Police Department was immense. It wasn't a large force. Officers who had joined expecting to handle traffic stops and neighborhood disputes now found themselves working one of the most notorious mass murders in Illinois history. They were exhausted, stretched thin, and under constant attack from critics who claimed they were in over their heads. Chief Bratcher did his best to shield his officers. At press conferences, he stood tall, insisting that his department was capable, that progress was being made. But behind closed doors, morale was low. Some officers doubted whether they would ever find the killers. Others were haunted by the crime scene itself. 7 bodies crammed into a freezer, faces frozen in terror. Meanwhile, false leads consumed precious time. One man, a drifter with a criminal record, became the focus of weeks of investigation. He had been in the area that night, and he fit the profile of someone capable of violence. Detectives tailed him, interrogated him, even put his photo in front of witnesses. But the evidence simply wasn't there. Eventually, he was cleared. Another theory suggested mob involvement. Organized crime had long had its tentacles in Chicago's suburbs, and some speculated the massacre was a message, perhaps to Brown's Chicken corporate, perhaps to an owner who had crossed the wrong people. But again, nothing solid connected the dots. Even the victims' families, desperate for closure, began to wonder if the truth would ever come. Michael Castro's parents became outspoken, appearing at vigils and in news interviews. They praised the police but demanded answers. How could their son's murderers simply vanish? The Ellenfeld daughters, devastated by the loss of both parents, quietly retreated from the spotlight but never stopped pressing for justice. As the months dragged on, hope began to wane. The initial flood of leads slowed. Reporters grew tired of covering press conferences with no new information. The Brown's Chicken in Palatine, once bustling, was shuttered. Its windows dark, its sign taken down, the building standing as a grim reminder of what had happened inside. And yet, beneath the frustration and despair, detectives clung to one stubborn belief. The killers had made mistakes. Somewhere, somehow, those mistakes would catch up to them. But in 1993, no one could see how. DNA evidence sat frozen, waiting for technology to catch up. Witnesses who might have come forward stayed silent. And two young men, Jim Degorski and Juan Luna, walked freely through the suburbs, carrying the dark secret of what they had done, confident that they had gotten away with murder. The first year after the massacre closed without arrests. For Palatine, the wound remained raw. 7 funerals had come and gone. The community was left with empty chairs at dinner tables, children growing up without parents, parents grieving children who would never return. And hovering over it all was the most agonizing question of all. Had the killers already slipped beyond reach? What no one knew was that the case would not be solved in months, or even years. It would take nearly a decade of persistence, of false starts, of small breakthroughs that seemed meaningless at the time. The Brown's Chicken Massacre would become not just a story of horror, but of endurance, an investigation that refused to die, even when hope nearly did. Long before the massacre at Brown's Chicken, the seeds of violence had already been planted in the lives of Jim Degorski and Juan Luna. On the surface, both came from the same suburban world as their victims. Quiet neighborhoods, strip malls, high schools where football games filled the stands on Friday nights. They were the kids you might pass in the hallways, see at a fast food counter, or notice hanging around outside a convenience store. They weren't outsiders from some distant world. They were part of the community. That was what made the truth so chilling. Jim Degorski grew up in Hoffman Estates, just a short drive from Palatine. His family life was unstable from the start. His father battled schizophrenia. His parents' marriage was turbulent. The house was loud with arguments, tense with instability. For Jim, control became an obsession. He craved it over situations, over people, over life itself. By high school, he was already known as a troublemaker. At Fremd High, classmates described him as moody, unpredictable, prone to cruel outbursts. He wore jean jackets and heavy metal t-shirts, boasting about how one day he'd do something big. The bravado wasn't harmless posturing. He had a streak of violence that surfaced again and again. He dated a girl named Kristen Lindstrom. At first, she saw his charm, his confidence. But soon, the darker side revealed itself. He hit her, threw her downstairs, threatened her life. One night, he tied her up, shoved her into the trunk of a car, and drove her into the night, telling her he could kill her if he wanted to. She escaped with her life, but the warning was clear. Jim Degorski was dangerous. Despite these red flags, Jim floated through the suburbs with little consequence. Arrests for petty theft, stolen cars, battery, each time he skated by with light punishment. People wrote him off as a screw-up, a burnout, a stoner who would never amount to much. No one saw him for what he was becoming. A man who found pleasure in domination, in cruelty, in control. Then there was Juan Luna. Born in Mexico, Juan came to the U.S. as a boy. His family settled in the same suburban sprawl as the Degorskis. Quiet, reserved, he didn't stand out the way Jim did. At Fremd High, he kept a lower profile. He wasn't a leader, not a loudmouth, not the type to draw attention. But beneath the surface, he had a restless anger. He bragged about owning a pistol. He got into fights. He drifted toward friends who shared his aimless, reckless energy. Jim and Juan met in high school through a vocational program. They clicked almost instantly. Jim had the swagger, Juan the quiet intensity. Together, they were trouble. They stole cars, smoked weed, drank too much, and spent nights bragging about what they'd do if they really wanted to make a name for themselves. Palatine had its share of restless teens, but these two were different. Where others dreamed of leaving town, going to college, building careers, Jim and Juan dreamed of violence. They wanted excitement, notoriety. They wanted to feel powerful in a world where they often felt powerless. And then, in the months leading up to January 1993, they began talking about a plan. It wasn't born out of desperation. They weren't starving. They weren't in debt to the mob. They weren't cornered into crime. It was born out of thrill-seeking cruelty. The plan was simple in its horror. Pick a place, rob it, and kill everyone inside. Leave no witnesses. Walk away knowing they had done something unforgettable. Jim carried the idea like a twisted badge of honor. He talked about it to friends, hinting that he wanted to do something big, something that would shock everyone. Juan, quieter but just as eager to prove himself, went along. Together, they fantasized about violence like others fantasized about sports or music or romance. And in early January 1993, they chose their target, a Brown's Chicken restaurant in Palatine. Why that location? Some said it was convenience, it was nearby, easy to get in and out. Others believed they saw it as vulnerable, staffed by teenagers and part-time workers, unlikely to fight back. For Jim and Juan, it didn't really matter. Any place would have done. Brown's Chicken just happened to be the unlucky choice. On the evening of January 8th, they prepared themselves. Jim carried the revolver. Juan, nervous but committed, followed his lead. They ate at the restaurant first, as if to savor the calm before unleashing terror. And then, step by step, they carried out the massacre. 7 lives ended. Community shattered. And 2 men walked out the doors, vanishing into the cold suburban night, believing they had just done exactly what they had promised. Something big. For nearly 10 years, they would walk free, smiling in photographs, holding jobs, attending parties, all the while carrying a secret that ate at those who knew them best. They bragged in private. They slipped up in whispers. But still, they were never caught. Not yet. After January 8, 1993, Jim Degorski and Juan Luna walked away from Brown's Chicken with blood on their hands and a false sense of invincibility. They had just committed one of the most brutal crimes in Illinois history. 7 executed in cold blood. And yet, in the days and weeks that followed, they carried on as if nothing had happened. Juan Luna returned home to his mother, who believed her quiet son was working hard and trying to find his way in life. Jim Degorski drifted between odd jobs, friends' couches, and bars. Outwardly, nothing about their lives screamed, mass murderers. And that was exactly how they managed to blend back into the sprawl of suburban Chicago. But beneath the surface, they couldn't resist talking. Jim, in particular, liked to brag. Violence had always been a point of pride for him, a way to prove his toughness. Now, he had a story bigger than any fight or petty crime. He told girlfriends, friends, and acquaintances that he had done something big. Some thought he was bluffing. After all, Jim always ran his mouth. Others were too scared to challenge him. One of the people he confided in was a young woman he dated after the murders. Over drinks and late-night conversations, Jim would let details slip. He described killing people, putting them down like animals, and feeling powerful afterward. She didn't know whether to believe him. It sounded outrageous, like one of Jim's usual attempts to shock. But the details matched the crime too closely to ignore. Juan, quieter, didn't talk as openly. But even he hinted to friends that he had been involved in something dark. He mentioned the Brown's Chicken killings, sometimes with a smirk that suggested more than coincidence. And yet, for years, no one came forward. Why? Because fear hung over every conversation. Jim Degorski wasn't the kind of man you crossed. He was volatile, abusive, capable of turning on anyone. To accuse him of mass murder could mean painting a target on your own back. Meanwhile, life in Palatine moved on, though the memory of the massacre never faded. Every anniversary brought back the pain. Every unsolved year deepened the frustration. People wondered how 7 people could be slaughtered in a brightly lit restaurant in the suburbs and no one be held accountable. What the public didn't know was that police had already collected the killer's biggest mistake. The half-eaten chicken thrown into the garbage. It was saved, frozen, preserved. In 1993, DNA testing couldn't make much of it. But science was advancing. Every year, forensic technology crept closer to the ability to pull a killer's identity from a greasy bite of food. While detectives waited for science to catch up, They were also waiting for people to talk. And slowly they did. Friends of Jim Degorski began to piece together that his boasts weren't jokes. Ex-girlfriends remembered conversations that seemed chilling in hindsight. People who had been too scared to speak at first started to feel the weight of their silence. But in the mid-1990s, those whispers still hadn't reached the ears of police. Jim and Juan carried on. They worked low-wage jobs, floated through relationships, and acted as though their crime had disappeared into history. They even mocked the investigation, laughing about how police were chasing the wrong suspects. For nearly a decade, they lived free. But each year, the pressure grew. Each year, DNA science improved. Each year, more people remembered things they had been too afraid to say. The arrogance of believing they had committed the perfect crime would eventually be their downfall. But in 1993 and 1994, Jim Degorski and Juan Luna were just two men hiding in plain sight, two men whose names had not yet been connected to the massacre that haunted Palatine. For the families of the victims, the silence was unbearable. They attended memorials, they prayed for justice, they begged for answers. Each day without an arrest felt like a betrayal. And yet, they held on to hope that one day, somehow, the truth would come out. What they didn't know was that the killers were already bragging about it, laughing about it, and living among them. The case was far from over. In fact, the investigation was only beginning its long, agonizing march toward justice. The Brown's Chicken Massacre shook Palatine in 1993, but as the weeks turned into months and the months turned into years, the trail began to cool. For detectives, it was agonizing. The first year had been a blur of tips, suspects, and pressure. They had worked themselves to exhaustion. They had brought in psychics, pursued mob theories, interrogated former employees, and tested the patience of grieving families with promises that leads were being followed. But by 1994, nothing concrete had materialized. The massacre loomed like a shadow over the department. Every officer felt the weight of it. It wasn't just another case, it was the case. The one people whispered about at backyard barbecues, at church, at school drop-offs. When parents saw a Palatine officer in uniform, they didn't ask about traffic enforcement or neighborhood watch. They asked about Browns. Have you found them yet? When will you make an arrest? The pressure seeped into the lives of the investigators themselves. Some were consumed by guilt, haunted by the sight of the freezer, the bodies piled together like forgotten groceries. Others wrestled with self-doubt, wondering if they had missed something obvious. Chief Bratcher defended his force fiercely, but even he knew the whispers, that Palatine PD had been too small, too inexperienced, too suburban to handle something this big, were eating away at his men. Meanwhile, the families of the victims lived with a grief that only deepened. Anniversaries became painful rituals. On January 8th each year, they gathered for memorials, lighting candles, reading the names of their loved ones, and renewing their pleas for justice. Reporters showed up, cameras rolling, capturing the tears of parents, siblings, and children. The headlines were always the same. Another year, still no arrests. The Ellenfeld daughters carried the impossible burden of losing both parents in one night. They grew up faster than anyone should, navigating adulthood with a hole that could never be filled. Michael Castro's parents clutched photos of their boy, his smile frozen in time, unable to watch other teenagers graduate, marry, and build families without thinking of the life he had been denied. And still, no answers came. For the community, the massacre became a ghost story. The shuttered Browns building sat abandoned, its windows dark, its walls holding memories too horrific to erase. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside, calling it haunted. To the older residents, it was more than haunted, it was cursed. Every time they drove past that corner of Northwest Highway, the yellow sign that once promised "it tastes better" now seemed like a cruel reminder of tragedy. Police, desperate for a break, clung to any thread. In 1994, they pursued a lead involving a former Browns employee who had allegedly been fired on bad terms. Whispers in town named him as the possible killer. Detectives interrogated him for hours, scouring his past. In the end, it was another dead end. His life was ruined by suspicion, but he was innocent. Theories shifted. Some believed it had been a thrill killing, young men who wanted to prove themselves by doing the unthinkable. Others still leaned toward organized crime. Why else would such a brutal act be carried out with such precision? And through it all, Jim Degorski and Juan walked free. Jim spent his nights drinking, his days drifting. He bragged to girlfriends, hinted to acquaintances, laughed when news reports came on TV about the massacre. "That was me," he would sometimes say, grinning as though it were a sick joke. Most people brushed it off. Jim was always mouthing off, always trying to shock. Who would take him seriously? Juan was quieter, but he carried his own arrogance. He told a few trusted friends he had been there that night. He let details slip that only someone involved could know. And still, no one came forward. Fear kept them silent. Who wanted to accuse a man of mass murder without proof? By 1995, the case file had swollen into boxes that filled evidence rooms. Detectives rotated in and out of the task force. Each new investigator hoped to be the one to crack it, to give the families their closure, to put an end to the whispers that Palatine had failed. But year after year they came up empty, and so the case, once white-hot, began to cool. In the newspapers, it shifted from front page to page 3. On television, it became a quick anniversary segment instead of the lead story. In the community, it became a scar that everyone carried but no one could heal. The killers had done what they set out to do: leave no witnesses. And for a time, it seemed they had succeeded in escaping justice. But what they couldn't know was that science was evolving. The scraps of evidence bagged in 1993, the half-eaten chicken tossed into a garbage can, were still waiting. Frozen, preserved, silent. And one day, years later, those scraps would speak. By the mid-1990s, the Brown's Chicken Massacre was beginning to feel like a wound that would never close. The crime scene had long since been cleaned. The building stood empty, a hollow reminder of that winter night. But the memories remained vivid, etched into the lives of the families, the investigators, and the community that had once believed tragedy belonged to other places. Not here. The families carried on because they had no other choice. But each did so in their own way, bound by grief that never loosened its grip. Michael Castro's parents, Ray and Ann, tried to keep their son's memory alive by speaking publicly about him. Michael had been only 16, a kid who loved basketball, who still had homework assignments tucked in his backpack when he was murdered. His mother clung to his school photos, unable to reconcile the smiling boy in them with the brutal way he had died. He was just a kid working for gas money, Ray would say bitterly, not someone who deserved to be left in a freezer. For the Ellenfelt daughters, the loss of both parents was devastating. Lynn and Richard had been more than owners of a chicken restaurant. They were the glue of their family. Their daughters had grown up with Lynn's nurturing steadiness and Richard's drive. Suddenly, in one night, they were gone. Holidays became unbearable. Family milestones, graduations, weddings were reminders of who was missing. The daughters leaned on each other, but the wound never closed. The Maldonado family mourned Guadalupe, a man who had come to Illinois to provide for his loved ones. His absence was more than emotional, it was financial. The paycheck that had put food on the table was gone, leaving behind hardship layered on top of heartbreak. For every victim, there was a ripple effect. Siblings, parents, children, friends, each living with a piece of the massacre lodged inside them. Meanwhile, the case files continued to grow dusty. Detectives still worked leads when they could, but other crimes demanded attention. Budgets were tight, and morale had been battered by years of frustration. Palatine PD still marked anniversaries, still promised the case was open, still told families they were trying. But the optimism of those early days had dimmed. And yet, something had changed quietly in labs across the country. Forensic science was advancing. In 1993, DNA testing was limited, clunky, unreliable for small samples. But by the late 1990s, new techniques like PCR amplification and STR analysis were revolutionizing how tiny scraps of biological material could be turned into genetic profiles. Across the U.S., cold cases once thought unsolvable were being cracked open. And in a freezer, in Palatine's evidence storage, sat a bag of chicken bones. Half-eaten pieces thrown in the garbage by two killers who thought nothing of their carelessness. Police had preserved them, unsure if they would ever be useful. Now, years later, they represented hope. Still, even with science catching up, detectives needed suspects to test against. And that meant waiting for anyone, to talk. That wait was longer than anyone imagined. Jim Degorski and Juan lived nearly a decade as free men. They worked jobs. They dated. They went to parties. They told stories. And those stories, whispered in bedrooms and backyards, began to linger. Jim couldn't keep his mouth shut. He boasted to girlfriends about the murders, bragging that he and a friend had killed 7 people at a Brown's Chicken. To some, it sounded like sick bravado. Jim always tried to shock people, always wanted attention. But the details were too precise. Some girlfriends were terrified. Others told themselves he was exaggerating. Few went to police. Juan, quieter, wasn't as brazen. But even he let things slip. He hinted to a small circle of friends about being there. He knew details that had never been made public. Each time, the listener was left uneasy, torn between disbelief and dread. For years, those whispers remained private. Fear kept people silent. Who wanted to accuse a man of mass murder without proof? And what if Jim Degorski found out you had talked? But by the end of the decade, silence was becoming harder to maintain. Relationships soured. Guilt grew heavier. People who had once dismissed Jim's boasts began to wonder. What if he was telling the truth? And just as the whispers began to surface, detectives were preparing to try again with the evidence preserved from that winter night. It had been nearly a decade. The case was cold. But it wasn't dead. By the late 1990s, the Brown's Chicken Massacre had settled into the category no investigator ever wanted to admit out loud. A cold case. The anniversary vigils continued. The families still gathered. The reporters still came with cameras and notebooks. But behind the scenes, the detectives knew they were running in circles. The leads had dried up, and the case boxes seemed to grow heavier each year. For many in Palatine, the idea of an arrest felt more like hope than possibility. But science was about to change that. Stored in a freezer since 1993, the greasy remains of a half-eaten chicken dinner were pulled from evidence. Back then, it had seemed almost pointless to save. Who could imagine that DNA could survive on food discarded in a restaurant trash can? But some crime scene technician had bagged it, labeled it, and frozen it anyway. That decision would prove pivotal. By the late 90s, DNA testing had evolved. Scientists could now take minuscule samples and amplify them, building genetic fingerprints from material that once would have been dismissed as useless. Across the country, cold cases were being solved this way. And in Palatine, the Browns' evidence was about to be tested with these new methods. When the results came back, investigators finally had something tangible. DNA from an unknown male. It wasn't a name. It wasn't an arrest. But it was proof. Whoever had eaten that chicken had been inside the restaurant on the night of the murders. And whoever it was, they had left behind a trace of themselves that could never be erased. Now detectives needed a match. The years dragged on as samples were compared, suspects swabbed, databases searched. Still no hit. But the DNA profile sat waiting like a key with no lock. Meanwhile, Jim Degorski and Juan continued their lives, convinced they had outsmarted everyone. They watched news reports about the murders, sometimes with a sick sense of pride. Jim told friends again and again that he had been there, bragging in drunken rants that he and Juan had pulled it off. Juan, quieter, sometimes nodded along, sometimes dropped details that no one else could know. At first, people dismissed them. But over time, as relationships shifted, girlfriends broke away, and friends drifted apart, those confessions became heavier. Some of the women Jim had dated remembered the things he had said. They remembered the fear they had felt at the time, and they began to wonder if staying silent was protecting a monster. By the early 2000s, nearly a decade after the massacre, Palatine police finally got the call they had been waiting for. A tip had come in. A woman who had dated Jim Degorski was ready to talk. She told investigators that Jim had confessed to her about the murders. He had described details only the killers could know. Suddenly, after years of dead ends, the case flickered back to life. Detectives began to look closely at Degorski, a name that had surfaced before in vague rumors but had never been pursued seriously. And alongside him was Juan, the quiet accomplice who had always been at Jim's side. Investigators obtained DNA samples from Luna. When they compared his genetic profile to the one found on the chicken bones, the results were undeniable. It was a match. Nearly 10 years of frustration, of grief, of doubt. All of it converged on this one piece of evidence, preserved by chance, unlocked by science. The killers had left their signature on a half-eaten meal, and now it had spoken. Jim Degorski and Juan were no longer whispers, no longer suspicions. They were suspects, soon to be named publicly, arrested, and forced to face what they had done. For the families, it was a moment of cautious relief. After so many years of promises, they had learned not to celebrate too quickly. But this time was different. This time it was real. The Browns' chicken massacre was no longer unsolved. The walls of silence that had protected the killers were finally beginning to crack. And as the arrests approached, Palatine braced itself. Justice had been delayed for nearly a decade, but it was finally on its way. When the DNA match came back to Juan, investigators finally had what they had been waiting for. A name tied to the crime scene. But a name alone wasn't enough. Detectives knew this case had to be airtight. 10 years of waiting had built an almost unbearable pressure. Families wanted justice. The community wanted closure. And prosecutors demanded certainty. If Palatine police were going to finally arrest the men responsible, they needed more than science. They needed confessions, corroboration, and a chain of evidence so strong that no defense attorney could rip it apart. So they moved carefully. Surveillance teams were assigned to track both Jim Degorski and Juan. They watched their routines, where they worked, who they spoke with, how they carried themselves. They noted when Jim lost his temper in public, when Juan retreated into quiet anonymity. The killers had aged since 1993, but they were still living ordinary lives, never suspecting that investigators were now circling closer every day. The real breakthrough came with the interviews. Detectives brought in Luna first. They knew he was the weaker link, the quieter of the two, the one more likely to break under pressure. They confronted him with the DNA evidence. The science didn't lie. Luna had eaten that chicken. He had been inside Brown's on the night of the massacre. At first, Luna denied everything. He shook his head, claimed innocence, insisted there had been some mistake. But the more they pressed, the more he faltered. Hours dragged on. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in. Finally, he cracked. Luna confessed to being there that night. He admitted that he and Jim Degorski had carried out the robbery, and that together they had murdered 7 innocent people. It was the moment investigators had dreamed of for years. Jim Degorski's arrest came soon after. Unlike Luna, Jim was defiant. He smirked through questioning, dismissing the evidence, mocking the detectives. He seemed almost proud, as if being linked to the massacre was proof that he had done what he always promised. Something big. On May 18, 2002, news of the arrests broke. The community that had lived under the shadow of the massacre for nearly a decade erupted in shock. After years of thinking the killers had vanished into the ether, they now learned the truth. The murderers had been living among them all along. Television anchors delivered the updates in urgent tones. Newspapers ran bold headlines: "Arrests Ian Brown's massacre." Families of the victims, though still raw with grief, finally felt the faint stirrings of justice. For the Castro family, it was both relief and pain. They had waited nearly 10 years to hear who had killed their son. Now they had names, faces, men who would finally be held accountable. For the Ellenfelt daughters, it meant their parents' story wouldn't end in silence. For the Maldonados, it meant Guadalupe's death would not be forgotten. But the arrests were just the beginning. What followed would be years of court battles, motions, delays, and trials that tested the endurance of everyone involved. The families who had already spent a decade waiting for justice would be asked to wait even longer. For the moment, though, there was victory in the air. The Browns' chicken massacre was no longer unsolved. The killers had names. They had faces. They were in custody. And at long last, Palatine could believe that justice was finally within reach. The news hit Illinois like a thunderclap. After nearly a decade of mystery, Palatine residents woke up in May 2002 to learn that the Browns chicken killers had been caught. The names, Juan and Jim Degorski, were splashed across front pages, plastered on TV screens, and whispered in workplaces, schools, and coffee shops. For so long, the case had been a scar without a face. Now it had two. The shock was compounded by one unsettling fact. They weren't strangers. They weren't shadowy outsiders. They were local boys, raised in the same neighborhoods, walking the same suburban streets as their victims. Neighbors remembered Jim Degorski as the tall, rough-edged troublemaker from Fremd High School, the kid always mouthing off, always stirring trouble. Some weren't surprised at all. One former classmate told reporters, "He always said he was going to do something big. I guess we didn't know he meant this." Others struggled to reconcile the goofy teen they remembered with the monster described in court documents. He had lived so long in plain sight, his violence hidden under layers of arrogance and bravado. Juan name carried a different weight. Quiet, soft-spoken, a father now. People who knew him were stunned. He had married, had a child, worked in the suburbs, even built a reputation as a hardworking family man. To many, he seemed the last person who could have been involved in such a crime. But those who had known him longer remembered flashes of anger, the way he gravitated toward Jim, the way he carried a chip on his shoulder. For the families of the victims, the arrests were both a salve and a new wound. Ray and Castro wept as they addressed the media. "We've waited 9 years for this," Ray said, clutching a photo of Michael. "Nothing brings him back, but now we know. Now we can see this through." The Ellenfeld daughters spoke of their parents with a bittersweet tone. For years, they had dreaded anniversaries marked by silence. Now, for the first time, there was movement toward accountability. "It doesn't end the pain," one daughter told a reporter, "but it gives us hope that maybe justice is still possible." The Maldonado family, still aching from the loss of Guadalupe, faced the mixed emotions of relief and rage. To know who had killed him was to confront their faces in newspapers, to hear their voices on the evening news, to feel the sting of reality all over again. The media seized on every detail. Cameras followed police cars as Degorski and Luna were transported in cuffs. Reporters dug through yearbooks, found old classmates, tracked down neighbors and ex-girlfriends. Every scrap of their pasts was suddenly public property. For Jim Degorski's former girlfriends, the news confirmed the darkest suspicions they had buried for years. He had told them he killed people. He had described the Browns massacre in chilling detail. Some had dismissed it as bravado. Others had been too terrified to speak. Now they realized he had been telling the truth all along. For Luna's acquaintances, the shock was heavier. He had kept his secrets quieter, tucked away behind his calm demeanor. But the DNA told the story he never could. In Palatine, the abandoned Brown's Chicken restaurant became a magnet for TV crews, community members, and the curious. People left flowers at the site, as if reopening the wound demanded a fresh memorial. Standing before the boarded-up building, a local resident summed up what many felt. "We've been living with ghosts for 9 years. Now we know who they were." But even as arrests brought relief, reality quickly set in. This was only the beginning. The legal system is slow, and cases of this magnitude crawl forward with painstaking care. Prosecutors promised they would pursue the death penalty. Defense attorneys vowed to fight every step. And for the families, that meant more waiting, more hearings, more painful retellings of the night that had destroyed their lives. Still, for the first time in nearly a decade, there was light at the end of the tunnel. The men who thought they had escaped justice were behind bars. Their names were no longer rumors, no longer whispers. They were accused killers, publicly identified, stripped of the arrogance that had let them believe they were untouchable. The trials lay ahead. The arguments, the evidence, the endless delays. All of it would test the patience of a community that had already endured so much. But Palatine finally had what it had long been denied: answers. The arrests of Jim Degorski and Juan in 2002 marked a turning point in the Browns chicken case. For nearly a decade, the families had waited for this moment. But they quickly discovered that arrests were not the end. They were only the beginning of another long, painful chapter. Trials in America, especially capital cases, are not swift. They move like glaciers, bogged down by motions, hearings, and endless legal maneuvering. And this case was destined to be one of the most complicated Illinois had ever seen. From the start, prosecutors were determined to seek the death penalty. 7 people had been executed in cold blood. If ever there was a case that demanded the ultimate punishment, they argued this was it. The sheer brutality of the Brown's Chicken Massacre demanded nothing less. But the defense was equally determined. For Juan Luna, attorneys argued that his confession had been coerced. They claimed detectives had pressured and manipulated him into admitting his involvement. They painted him as a vulnerable man, not a hardened killer, suggesting that his words in that interrogation room could not be trusted. They didn't deny the DNA evidence. After all, science had placed him at the scene, but they insisted his role had been exaggerated, that Jim Degorski was the true mastermind. For Jim, the defense took a different angle. He had not left DNA at the scene. There was no physical evidence tying him directly to Brown's Chicken that night. Without a confession like Luna's, prosecutors would have to rely heavily on witness testimony. Friends, girlfriends, acquaintances who claimed Jim had bragged about the crime. The defense sought to undermine these witnesses, portraying them as unreliable, bitter ex-partners with motives to lie. It became clear that the trials would be long, contested battles. For the families, each hearing was both a beacon of hope and a source of anguish. They sat in courtrooms, listening to arguments that reduced their loved ones' lives to exhibits and motions. They saw the faces of the men accused of killing their children and parents, men who smirked, whispered, or stared blankly at the floor. Every court date reopened the wound. Delays piled up, motions to suppress evidence, motions to change venue, arguments over jury selection. Years passed and still no trial date was set. The families endured birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays without their loved ones, while also enduring the limbo of a justice system that seemed incapable of moving quickly. Meanwhile, the community that had once celebrated the arrests grew restless. Newspapers began running headlines about delays. Editorials asked why it was taking so long. Some feared the killers might escape justice altogether if procedural mistakes were made. And then came a seismic shift in Illinois law. In 2003, Governor George Ryan commuted all death sentences in the state and effectively ended the death penalty in Illinois. For the families who had believed Degorski and Luna would face execution if convicted, it was a devastating blow. Now, the maximum punishment would be life in prison without parole. For some, that felt like a betrayal. For others, it was enough. After all, at least they would never walk free again. But the change set the stage for years of wrangling over sentencing, and it meant prosecutors had to recalibrate their approach. The legal process was slow, excruciating, and at times seemed endless. But beneath it all was a quiet determination, both from prosecutors and from the families, that no matter how long it took, they would see it through. Jim Degorski and Juan Luna had once believed they had committed the perfect crime. Now, they were trapped in a system designed to make them answer for it. It wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be easy. But the wheels of justice were turning. And eventually, they would grind all the way to verdicts that would echo across Illinois. By 2007, more than 14 years had passed since the Brown's Chicken Massacre. For the families of the victims, the wait for justice had been almost unbearable. For the prosecutors, the challenge was monumental. Present a case so strong, so undeniable, that a jury would convict Juan Luna beyond a shadow of a doubt. The trial opened in Cook County with intense media coverage. Reporters filled the courthouse, sketch artists captured every expression, and satellite trucks lined the streets. For a new generation of Illinoisans, it was the first time they were seeing the massacre laid bare in real time. Not as a cold case mystery, but as a trial with living, breathing defendants. The prosecution's case was anchored by 2 powerful pillars: DNA and Luna's own confession. They began with the science. Expert witnesses took the stand to explain how saliva recovered from a half-eaten piece of chicken in the Brown's garbage matched Juan Luna's genetic profile. It was a forensic bullseye, linking him directly to the scene on the night of the murders. This was no coincidence, prosecutors argued. He had been there. He had eaten. And then he had killed. Next came Luna's confession. Jurors watched hours of videotaped interrogation. In it, Luna admitted to being inside Brown's with Jim Degorski that night. He admitted they had planned a robbery. He admitted that things escalated. He admitted people were shot. His voice on tape, his words on record. Prosecutors framed it as the chilling truth from the killer himself. The defense countered with everything they had. They argued the confession was coerced, that detectives had worn Luna down over hours of questioning until he said what they wanted to hear. They highlighted his quiet demeanor, his lack of a prior violent record, painting him as a man who had been manipulated, not a mastermind. They pointed to Degorski as the instigator, the violent one, suggesting Luna had been dragged into something he never intended. But the jury heard more than just science and confessions. They heard from witnesses who remembered Jim and Juan talking about the murders years earlier. Former girlfriends, shaken but resolute, testified that Degorski had bragged about killing people at Brown's Chicken, that Luna had hinted at his involvement. Their words filled in the human context that DNA alone could not provide. As the days stretched into weeks, the courtroom became a theater of grief. Families of the victims sat in the gallery, listening to the details of how their loved ones had died. Some wept openly. Others stared coldly at Luna, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing their pain. When closing arguments came, prosecutors hammered their point home. Juan Luna wasn't some passive bystander. He wasn't a man swept up against his will. He was a willing participant in a robbery that turned into a massacre. He had pulled the trigger. He had taken lives. And he had lived freely for 14 years while the families mourned. The jury deliberated for hours that stretched into days. The families waited anxiously in the courthouse, their hearts pounding with every rumor of a decision. Finally, in May 2007, the verdict came, guilty on all counts. Luna was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families, it was a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Justice had been delivered, but it had taken nearly a decade and a half. Nothing could bring their loved ones back, but at least one of the men responsible would never walk free again. Juan Luna was led away in shackles, his quiet demeanor unchanged, his future sealed inside the walls of a prison cell. But justice was not yet complete. Another trial still loomed, the trial of Jim Degorski, the man prosecutors described as the instigator, the one who had pulled the trigger alongside Luna. And if Luna's conviction was a hard-fought victory, Degorski's trial would be even more explosive. With Juan Luna convicted in 2007, the long shadow of the Brown's Chicken massacre narrowed to one man, Jim Degorski. From the very beginning, prosecutors had described him as the instigator, the man who had pushed for the robbery, who relished the violence, who bragged afterward about the bloodshed. If Luna had been the quieter accomplice, Degorski was the swaggering predator, the one who wanted to do, in his own words, something big. But unlike Luna, Degorski hadn't left his DNA at the scene. There were no saliva stains on the chicken bones tying him directly to the murders. That absence of physical evidence gave his defense attorneys an opening, one they planned to drive hard. Without DNA, without fingerprints, how could anyone prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Jim Degorski had been inside Brown's that night? The trial began in 2009. The courtroom was once again packed. Families of the victims in the front rows, reporters scribbling notes, the public eager to see the final chapter unfold. Prosecutors knew they had to build their case on two pillars: Degorski's own words and the testimony of those who had heard them. They called witness after witness, ex-girlfriends, old friends, acquaintances, people who remembered Degorski bragging about killing 7 people at Brown's. Some said he laughed as he described the murders. Others recalled him saying it made him feel powerful. One former girlfriend told jurors that Jim had spoken about shooting victims in the back of the head, a detail never released publicly. It was chilling testimony, and it painted a portrait of a man who not only killed but relished in the telling. The jury also heard Luna's confession, in which he had implicated Degorski as his partner in the crime. The two men, the confession revealed, had planned the robbery together, carried it out together, and executed the victims together. The defense pushed back hard. They argued that the state's case relied on unreliable witnesses, bitter ex-girlfriends with motives to lie, people eager to insert themselves into a notorious case. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence tying Jim to the crime scene. No DNA.
No fingerprints.
Nothing concrete. Just words, they said. Words that could be twisted, misremembered, or fabricated. Still, the testimony weighed heavily. Jurors listened to stories of Degorski bragging, mocking, reliving the murders as though they were badges of honor. They saw him in court, sometimes smirking, sometimes bored, seemingly unfazed by the pain around him. For the families, the trial was agony. They had already sat through one trial, already endured the gruesome details, already listened to defense attorneys downplay their loved ones' deaths. Now they had to do it all again. Some sat with photos of the victims on their laps, silent reminders of why they were there. Others clenched their hands, refusing to look at Degorski, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing their pain. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Tension gripped the courthouse. When the verdict came, it echoed the first, guilty on all counts. Like Luna, Jim Degorski was sentenced to life in prison without parole. There would be no release, no second chance, no escape from justice. He would live out the rest of his days behind bars. For the families, it was another moment of relief, though tempered by the years of loss that no verdict could erase. Still, they had finally seen both killers held accountable. The case that had haunted Palatine for nearly 2 decades was closed, not in mystery, but in judgment. The Brown's Chicken Massacre would never be forgotten. But now, at least, it had resolution. When the gavel came down for the last time in Jim Degorski's trial, the Brown's Chicken case was officially closed. Both men were convicted. Both were sentenced to life without parole. The legal system had spoken. For the families, it was a victory they had dreamed of for nearly 17 years. But victory did not feel the way they imagined it would. Justice is never clean in cases like this. No sentence, no verdict, no prison cell could bring back what had been stolen. The trials were over, but the losses remained permanent, sharp, and raw. Ray and Castro, who had spent almost half their lives fighting for justice for their son Michael, walked out of the courtroom knowing they had finally kept their promise to him, to never let his murder be forgotten. Yet the moment was bittersweet. "We've waited so long for this," Ray said quietly. "But the truth is, we'll always be waiting for Michael to walk through that door." For the Ellenfeld daughters, the trials marked the end of a marathon they never asked to run. They had testified, endured endless hearings, and sat through testimony that described their parents' last moments in horrific detail. Now that it was over, they could finally exhale, but the silence left behind was heavy. Their parents had been taken in one night, and no courtroom could give them back the years they had lost. The Maldonado family, who had come to the U.S. chasing opportunity, carried the pain of Guadalupe's murder like an open wound. Seeing his killers convicted brought a measure of justice, but not peace. His absence remained at the dinner table, in birthdays missed, in the lives of his children altered forever. For the survivors and families, justice was never about closure, it was about accountability. The word closure felt too neat, too final, as though a verdict could erase the empty chairs, the birthdays that passed without candles, the generations altered. What they had was not closure, but resolution. The knowledge that Degorski and Luna would never walk free again. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked the families how they felt. Some spoke of gratitude to the prosecutors, the detectives, and the community that never let the case be forgotten. Others spoke with bitterness, pointing out that it had taken nearly 17 years to get here, that they had endured delay after delay, hearing after hearing, while the killers lived freely for nearly a decade. The community of Palatine, too, wrestled with the outcome. For many, the Brown's Chicken Massacre had defined the town's identity for years. Parents had raised their children in the shadow of the murders, using the tragedy as a warning about the dangers of the world. With the verdicts delivered, Palatine could finally take a step forward, even if the scars remained. The old Brown's Chicken restaurant, long since closed, had been torn down years earlier. The empty lot was a silent marker, a place where 7 lives ended, and where an entire community's innocence was stolen. For some, seeing it gone was a relief. For others, it was another loss, the disappearance of a physical reminder of why they had fought so hard for justice. As the families left the courthouse that final day, one truth hung in the air. The trials were over, but the grief was not. For them, justice was not the end of the story. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, a life where memory, loss, and resilience would forever intertwine. When the cell doors clanged shut behind Jim Degorski and Juan Luna, a new chapter began. Not for the victims' families, who had lived with grief for years, but for the killers themselves. They had once walked freely through Palatine, blending into the background of suburban life. Now they were numbers in the Illinois Department of Corrections, stripped of their swagger, reduced to inmates serving life without parole. For Juan Luna, prison life was a stark contrast to the quiet family life he had once projected. He had been a husband, a father, a man who worked long hours and blended into anonymity. Behind bars, that facade fell away. Luna became just another convicted murderer in a system filled with men who had once thought they could get away with violence. Reports from inside suggested he kept a low profile, avoiding trouble, trying to fade into the background even within prison walls, just as he had in life before his arrest. Jim Degorski, on the other hand, carried his arrogance into prison. Known for his temper and his cruelty, he was far less successful at keeping a low profile. In fact, his name made him a target. The Brown's Chicken Massacre was infamous in Illinois. Other inmates knew exactly who he was. For some, that notoriety made him an enemy. For others, it made him a challenge. In 2009, not long after his conviction, Degorski was severely beaten by another inmate while being held in Cook County Jail. The attack left him with facial fractures and permanent damage. He later filed a lawsuit against the county, claiming the guards had failed to protect him. In 2014, he was awarded nearly $500,000 in a settlement, an outcome that enraged the families of the victims, who saw it as yet another injustice piled onto decades of pain. To them, Degorski had taken lives and then profited from his own suffering, a cruel twist of fate that underscored their anger. Inside the prison system, both men adapted in different ways. Luna became a shadow, focusing on survival, avoiding conflict, rarely drawing attention. Degorski, despite his injuries, continued to carry himself with a smirk, sometimes mocking guards or boasting to other inmates about his crime. If Luna represented guilt buried beneath silence, Degorski embodied arrogance that even prison couldn't erase. For the families, knowing the killers were behind bars brought some relief. But it also raised haunting questions. What did it mean that Degorski had lived long enough to sue for injuries, while their loved ones had been denied even a tomorrow? What did it mean that Luna, who had taken part in the massacre, could still breathe, eat, and exist when their family members could not? Prison had confined Jim and Juan, but it hadn't erased the rage that their crimes continued to stir. Over the years, their names would resurface occasionally in the press. A hearing, a lawsuit, a small update from the prison system. But largely, they faded into obscurity, spending their days in concrete cells. There's something big reduced to endless time measured in metal bars and locked doors. The Brown's Chicken Massacre had defined them forever. No matter what they did, no matter how many years passed, they would never escape being remembered not as men, but as murderers. And that was their true sentence: to live out their lives not only behind bars, but also under the weight of their own infamy. The Brown's Chicken Massacre didn't just scar a community. It reshaped how law enforcement in Illinois approached violent crime, cold cases, and forensic investigation. In 1993, when 7 people were executed inside a suburban fast food restaurant, the initial investigation struggled. The sheer brutality of the crime scene overwhelmed detectives. There were few witnesses, little physical evidence, and no immediate leads. Palatine police worked tirelessly, but in the years that followed, the case seemed to slip further and further from resolution. What changed, ultimately, was science. The half-eaten piece of chicken, initially bagged and stored almost as an afterthought, became the linchpin of the entire case. For nearly a decade it sat in evidence storage, waiting for forensic technology to catch up. When DNA testing advanced enough to extract a usable profile, It delivered the breakthrough that detectives had prayed for. That moment forever altered how Illinois law enforcement approached evidence. Items once considered insignificant, trash, scraps, hair, saliva, were now seen as potential gold mines. Departments across the state began training officers to think differently about crime scenes. Preserve everything, store carefully, and anticipate future advances in technology. The case also highlighted the importance of persistence. Cold cases were often relegated to dusty shelves, but the Browns' investigation proved that patience, coupled with science, could deliver results even after a decade of silence. Across Illinois, police departments began devoting more resources to reviewing old files, re-examining unsolved murders, and using DNA to bring long-delayed justice. At the same time, the massacre reshaped how communities thought about safety. Suburban Chicago had long been seen as insulated, almost immune to the kind of violence associated with big cities. The Browns' chicken murders shattered that illusion. Suddenly, fast food restaurants, shopping centers, and small businesses no longer felt untouchable. Parents warned their kids differently. Owners installed new locks, security cameras, and alarm systems. For many, Palatine was a turning point, proof that evil could erupt anywhere at any time. The legal aftermath carried lessons as well. The long delays in bringing Degorski and Luna to trial exposed cracks in the system. The challenges of managing complex cases, the toll of endless motions, and the anguish caused by years of waiting. For the victims' families, it was a brutal reminder that justice is often slow. For prosecutors, it was a call to handle future cases with more urgency, more focus, and better victim support. Even the death penalty debate was touched by Browns. When Governor George Ryan commuted all Illinois death sentences in 2003, families of the victims spoke out, some in anger, some in acceptance. The massacre became part of the broader conversation about whether the state should take lives in response to taking lives. 8 years later, Illinois abolished the death penalty entirely, leaving cases like Browns as part of the backdrop of that historic decision. Over time, the Browns chicken massacre became a case study in both failure and perseverance. Failure in the sense that it took nearly 10 years to bring the killers to justice, perseverance in the sense that detectives never stopped working, families never stopped demanding answers, and technology never stopped advancing until the truth could be revealed. It proved, above all, that no crime, no matter how cold, should ever be considered beyond reach. And in that way, the tragedy in Palatine left behind more than grief. It left behind a legacy, one that continues to influence how law enforcement across Illinois and beyond fights for justice. The Browns chicken massacre was not just another crime. It was a rupture in the collective psyche of suburban America. Palatine, Illinois was the kind of place people moved to for safety. Wide streets, quiet neighborhoods, schools with strong reputations. It was the kind of town parents pointed to when they said they wanted a better life for their kids. Crime was supposed to be something that happened somewhere else. On city corners, in dark alleys, not in the middle of a family restaurant where teenagers scooped French fries and wiped down tables after closing time. On the night of January 8, 1993, that illusion shattered. 7 ordinary people, workers and owners, young and old, were murdered in a place as mundane and familiar as a fast food restaurant. The randomness was part of the horror. These weren't people involved in dangerous lifestyles, risky choices, or criminal activity. They were doing what millions of Americans did every day. Working late, cleaning up, trying to make a living. And then they were gone. For suburban communities across Illinois, the massacre struck like lightning. Suddenly, small-town life didn't feel safe anymore. Business owners installed alarm systems. Teenagers who once took late shifts without worry now thought twice before locking up at night. Parents who once sent their kids off to work fast food jobs with pride and independence now lay awake, haunted by the thought, could it happen to us? The massacre also changed how people thought about strangers. Jim Degorski and Juan weren't masked intruders or out-of-town gangsters. They were local boys, kids from the same schools, the same neighborhoods. That truth was perhaps the most unsettling. Evil, it turned out, wasn't always out there. Sometimes it grew up next door. The media amplified the fear. Nightly news broadcasts replayed the horror, showing the boarded-up Brown's Chicken building, the yellow police tape, the faces of the victims. Parents clutched their children closer. Workers eyed closing shifts differently. Restaurants across the Midwest quietly adopted new security practices, aware that if it could happen in Palatine, it could happen anywhere. The Brown's Chicken chain itself never recovered. Though it continued operating for years after the massacre, the name became synonymous with tragedy. Customers couldn't drive past without remembering. Workers couldn't clock in without a shiver. Eventually, the chain dwindled to only a handful of stores, its decline inseparable from the shadow of that January night. Beyond the local community, the massacre seeped into the broader cultural narrative. It became a shorthand for vulnerability, a reminder that safety is fragile. True crime enthusiasts and criminologists alike studied the case as an example of how violence could erupt in the most ordinary settings. For years, Palatine was a name that carried weight. A small town known not for its schools or businesses, but for its dead. But culture is not just shaped by fear. It is also shaped by resilience. The families of the victims, though devastated, became pillars of strength. They spoke publicly, reminding others of who their loved ones were. Not just victims, but vibrant human beings with dreams, quirks, and futures stolen too soon. Their voices kept the massacre from becoming just another crime statistic. They insisted it remained a story about people, about lives cut short, about the cost of evil. In that way, the Brown's Chicken massacre left behind more than fear. It left behind a cultural lesson. That no community is immune, that vigilance is necessary, and that memory is powerful. For Palatine, the tragedy became part of its identity. For America, it became a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, violence can strike. The massacre redefined not just one town, but an entire generation's sense of safety. Not everyone who was tied to Brown's Chicken on January 8, 1993, died that night. Some survived, not because they escaped the killers, but because fate had placed them elsewhere. For them, survival was not a gift. It was a burden. There were the workers who had swapped shifts at the last minute. Teenagers who should have been behind the counter but had begged a coworker to cover for them. Friends who were supposed to meet after closing but canceled at the last second. These were the people who woke up the next morning and realized that a twist of timing had saved them, and condemned their friends. For years afterward, they carried what psychologists call survivor guilt. It wasn't rational. They knew they hadn't chosen who lived and who died. But the thought never left them. Why not me? Why was I spared when they weren't? Some wrestled with that guilt privately, unable to speak of it without breaking down. Others turned it outward, using it as fuel to advocate for the victims' families, to keep the memory of the 7 alive. Yet even those acts of resilience couldn't erase the deep shadow that followed them. Birthdays, weddings, milestones. All were tinged with the memory that 7 friends never had the chance to reach them. The trauma extended beyond the immediate circle of workers. Classmates at Fremd High School remembered walking into homeroom the next day and seeing empty seats. Teachers remembered the grief of consoling students who had lost friends overnight. Palatine residents, many of whom had eaten at that very restaurant, felt the shock ripple through their daily routines. Everyone in town had a Brown story, where they sat, what they ordered, who they went with. Suddenly, those memories were haunted. Some survivors tried to reclaim normalcy. A few went on to build careers, start families, and move far away from Palatine. But even distance couldn't erase the scars. Every time the case resurfaced in the news, at the arrests in 2002, at Luna's conviction in 2007, at Degorski's in 2009, they were pulled back into that night, reminded that their lives had been shaped by something they couldn't control. For the families of the victims, the trauma took another form. They carried grief, yes, but also the quiet torture of imagining the what-ifs. What if their loved one had called in sick? What if they had quit that job a week earlier? What if one small decision had shifted fate? Those questions had no answers, but they haunted the nights, pressing on the mind like a weight. In therapy rooms, in church basements, in late-night conversations with friends, the survivors and families tried to work through it. Some found faith. Some found advocacy. Some found only silence. And then there were the first responders, the police officers who walked into Brown's that night and found the grisly scene. Many of them carried the images for life. The silence of the locked restaurant, the bodies huddled in the freezer, the smell of gunpowder and grease. Several later admitted that nothing in their careers had ever compared. For some, it hardened them. For others, it hollowed them out. The Brown's Chicken Massacre did not just kill 7 people. It sent ripples outward that altered dozens, even hundreds of lives. Those who weren't there still carried it. Those who had been scheduled, but not present, sometimes carried it worst of all. Because survival, in this case, was not freedom. It was a lifelong reminder of the razor's edge between life and death. 4 years after the murders, the Brown's Chicken building on Northwest Highway stood like a scar in the middle of Palatine. It was just another fast food restaurant before January 8, 1993. Fluorescent lights, plastic booths, the smell of fried chicken and French fries wafting out into the winter air. But after that night, it became something else entirely. A tomb, a symbol of horror, a reminder of how ordinary spaces could turn into sites of unspeakable violence. In the days immediately after the massacre, the restaurant was sealed off with yellow tape. Reporters gathered outside. News helicopters flew overhead. Customers left flowers at the curb. But behind the glass, the interior remained frozen in time. Grease-stained counters, half-finished cleaning tasks, and, for days, the traces of tragedy investigators documented in silence. When the crime scene was finally cleared, the building didn't go back to life. Who could order food in a place where 7 people had died? Who could sit in a booth and not think about the freezer, the gunshots, the fear? The restaurant never reopened. Its doors stayed locked, its windows dark. But the building remained, a shell on the corner, an unavoidable reminder every time residents drove past. Parents whispered explanations to their kids in the back seat. Teenagers dared each other to get closer. For Palatine, it was impossible to ignore. It was right there, every day a physical marker of their loss. Over the years, debate swirled about what to do with it. Some argued it should be torn down immediately, out of respect for the victims and their families. Others believed it should stand as a memorial, a permanent reminder of what had happened. In the end, time itself made the decision. The property sat vacant for nearly a decade, decaying slowly, its parking lot overgrown with weeds, its sign weathered by sun and rain. Finally, in 2001, the building was demolished. For many, watching it fall was a release, a way of erasing the constant visual reminder of horror. But demolition couldn't erase memory. The empty lot still carried weight. For some, the absence was almost as haunting as the building itself. Over time, new businesses moved into the area. The lot was redeveloped, the physical trace of Brown's Chicken replaced by something else. Yet to locals, the ground was never just another piece of real estate. They knew what had happened there. They remembered the police cars, the candles, the boarded windows. Even without walls, the place held ghosts. The fate of the building reflected a larger truth. When tragedy strikes, physical spaces become more than bricks and mortar. They become symbols, absorbing the pain, fear, and memory of what happened inside. Removing them may change the skyline, but it doesn't remove the story. For Palatine, the Brown's Chicken building became a lesson in collective memory. Demolished or not, its presence lingered in conversation, in anniversaries, in the way people told newcomers that's where it happened. In that way, the building lived on, no longer standing but never gone. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest memories. But some crimes refuse to fade, kept alive not only by the families who mourn but also by the media that retells the story again and again. The Brown's Chicken Massacre became one of those crimes. From the very beginning, the media was central. In 1993, local news crews camped outside the restaurant for days, their cameras capturing the flicker of candles and the tears of neighbors. National outlets soon followed, broadcasting Palatine's grief to the entire country. For many Americans, the first time they ever heard of the town was not through a map or a tourist brochure, but through the words 7 dead at a Brown's Chicken. As the years passed and the case went unsolved, it became a fixture in anniversary specials. Every January, news outlets revisited the crime. Interviews with investigators, updates on leads, reflections from families still waiting for justice. The coverage kept the massacre in the public eye, a reminder that the killers were still free. When DNA finally cracked the case in 2002, the story surged again. It was framed not only as a victory for science but as a vindication for persistence. Documentaries and news magazines highlighted the chicken bone evidence, how something as mundane as saliva on food could topple a wall of silence. It became a case study in forensic classes, a teaching example in criminal justice programs, a favorite segment for true crime shows that wanted to showcase the power of DNA. Books soon followed, written by journalists who had covered the case from the beginning. They captured the pain of the families, the twists of the investigation, and the long wait for justice. For readers, the massacre became more than headlines. It became a story, a narrative of tragedy and determination. Television revisited it often. Programs like Forensic Files and Dateline devoted episodes to the Brown's chicken murders. Each retelling brought new audiences, new generations who hadn't been alive in 1993 but now knew the story. The details were always the same: the robbery, the freezer, the DNA, but the retelling kept the memory alive, refusing to let it slip into obscurity. Even as the years turned into decades, anniversaries continued to bring coverage. On the 10th, the 20th, the 25th anniversaries, reporters returned to Palatine. They stood on the site where the restaurant once stood, interviewing townspeople, reminding viewers that while time had moved on, the memory had not. The massacre also became a touchstone in the rise of America's true crime fascination. Podcasts, YouTube channels, and online forums dissected it, not just as a mystery but as a cultural moment. The case offered everything true crime audiences craved: a brutal crime, a decade-long manhunt, a forensic breakthrough, and dramatic trials. For better or worse, the Brown's Chicken Massacre became part of the genre's canon. For the families, the media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it ensured their loved ones were never forgotten. On the other, it meant the wound was reopened every time a new documentary aired or a podcast episode dropped. Their children, siblings, parents, forever remembered not for how they lived, but for how they died. Still, the coverage served a purpose. It preserved the story in collective memory, ensuring that what happened in Palatine in 1993 would never be erased. Because crimes fade only when they are forgotten. And the Brown's Chicken Massacre was never forgotten. By the time Juan and Jim Degorski were convicted, the Brown's Chicken Massacre had already transcended the boundaries of a single case. It had become part of America's larger cultural conversation about crime, safety, and why society can't look away from horror. The 1990s were a turning point in how Americans consumed crime stories. Court TV was rising. Cable news was expanding. High-profile trials, from O.J. Simpson to Oklahoma City, captured the nation's attention. And alongside them, cases like Brown's shaped the way true crime seeped into everyday conversation. The massacre had all the elements that draw people in. Randomness, ordinary workers cut down in an everyday setting. Mystery, years with no answers, no arrests, just silence. Breakthrough science, the DNA on a chicken bone, a detail as strange as it was groundbreaking. Courtroom drama, two killers on trial, families confronting them, justice delayed but not denied. It was horrifying, yes, but also strangely magnetic. People wanted to know how, why, what could drive two young men to such senseless slaughter. The story played on the same paradox that fuels true crime fascination everywhere. Disgust and curiosity intertwined. Psychologists point out that stories like Brown's force people to confront uncomfortable truths. We want to believe we're safe, that violence happens far away to other people. The massacre in Palatine shattered that illusion. It told suburban America that even the corner restaurant could be a stage for bloodshed. By retelling the story, whether in documentaries, podcasts, or anniversary specials, society was not just remembering. It was rehearsing fear, grappling with vulnerability. At the same time, the case fed into the broader boom of true crime as entertainment. In the 2000s and beyond, as DNA solved more cold cases, audiences became hooked on the idea that no secret could remain hidden forever. The Browns case became an example, cited in classrooms and crime shows alike. Science could speak for the dead, even a decade later. But there was another layer to the cultural legacy: the uneasy fascination with killers themselves. Jim Degorski, with his arrogance and violent streak, became the archetype of a remorseless predator. Juan, quieter, a family man on the surface, became the archetype of the hidden monster, the neighbor you'd never suspect. Together, they embodied a terrifying duality: evil that boasted and evil that blended in. For many, the story reinforced a lesson that safety is always fragile. Locks and alarms could only do so much. Evil sometimes wore a familiar face, and that realization left a cultural bruise, one that never quite healed. Even today, in the vast ocean of true crime content, the Brown's Chicken Massacre still stands out. It's not just another murder story. It's a parable of lost innocence, delayed justice, and the haunting truth that safety is never guaranteed. And in that sense, its legacy stretches beyond Palatine. It belongs to the larger American story of how we wrestle with violence, how we remember victims, and how we try, sometimes desperately, to make sense of the senseless. In the end, the Brown's Chicken Massacre was about more than a crime. It was about lives interrupted, families shattered, a community scarred, and a justice system tested. 7 people walked into work on a cold January night in 1993. They were not celebrities, not politicians, not people who had chosen danger. They were ordinary men and women, teenagers and adults, living ordinary lives. And yet, in their final moments, they became part of one of the darkest chapters in suburban American history. For the families, the story has never really ended. Decades later, they still carry the weight of absence. The empty chairs at holidays, the milestones forever missed. They learned to live with grief, but grief never left them. And yet, they also carried resilience. They kept their loved ones' names alive, spoke their stories into the world, and refused to let them be reduced to statistics. For law enforcement, the case became a lesson in persistence and science. It proved that no scrap of evidence was too small, no cold case too cold, no file too dusty. A single bite of chicken, preserved for years, became the key to unlocking a mystery that once seemed unsolvable. That truth has guided detectives ever since. Save everything, because one day, technology may speak where silence once reigned. For Palatine, the massacre forever altered its identity. A town once defined by quiet suburban life became a name synonymous with tragedy. But in time, it also became a symbol of endurance, a place where memory and healing coexist, where the past is acknowledged but does not define the future. For America, the Brown's Chicken Massacre joined the canon of crimes that changed how we think about safety. It reminded us that violence can strike in the most ordinary places, that evil can wear familiar faces, that innocence can vanish in the span of minutes. But it also reminded us of the other side of the story: the determination of families, the breakthroughs of science, the pursuit of justice no matter how long it takes. As for Jim Degorski and Juan, their names will forever be shackled to their crime. They will live out their days in prison, remembered not as men but as murderers. Their something big was not glory, but infamy, and history will never grant them more than that. The true legacy belongs to the victims: Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt, Thomas Menace, Marcus Nelson, Michael Castro, Guadalupe Maldonado, and Rico Solis. They were more than victims. They were parents and children, friends and co-workers, dreamers and doers. They deserved long lives, full of ordinary joys. Their absence is the wound at the center of this story. Their memory is the reason it is told. Nearly 3 decades later, the Brown's Chicken Massacre still echoes. It echoes in classrooms where forensic science is taught. It echoes in documentaries that revisit the tragedy. It echoes in the hearts of families who loved and lost. And in that echo lies the truth. The story is not about the killers. It is about the lives they tried to erase, the families who refused to forget, and the community that, despite its scars, still stands. Justice was delayed, but it came. Memory was threatened, but it endured. And the story of Brown's Chicken, tragic, haunting, unforgettable, remains a reminder that even in the darkest chapters, truth can be found, voices can be heard, and the victims' lives can continue to matter.